were there conflicts between the Angles and the Saxons after these ethnic groups settled in England, or did these ethnic groups fully integrate into a single political entity? So we're talking about England, the British Isles. The British Isles were under Roman occupation until roughly the 4th century AD. Eventually, the Western Roman Empire, which was ruled from Rome, it eventually declined. And the Romans eventually withdrew from England, from the British Islands, because it was too far away and they didn't have the money to administer it all. So they simply withdrew. And once the Romans withdrew, they withdrew sometime around the 4th or 5th century, around that time, the transition period between the two centuries, around the time the Romans withdrew. Let's quickly Google this. When did the Romans withdraw from Britain? Which year was it? Okay, AD 410, which is the beginning of the 5th century AD. And that created a power vacuum in what we now call Britain. Power vacuum. The imperial force is gone. The imperial power is gone. Rome is gone. There's a power vacuum. So something has to fill the power vacuum. It was the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, these Germanic tribes, who filled the power vacuum. So the Saxons came from the region of Saxony in Germany. The Angles came from another part of Germany, and the Jews were also a Germanic tribe. So the Angles and the Saxons were the major population groups that invaded Britain and settled in Britain, and the Jutes also settled in the southern part of Britain. So if you look at the population of Britain at the time, it was mainly a Celtic population. The original inhabitants of Britain around the time of the Roman occupation were Celtic peoples, Pictish people, various Celtic ethnic groups and tribes. Then the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes come in, and then they fight. They defeat the Celtic peoples, and they establish various kingdoms in Britain. What did these kingdoms look like? Let's take a look. Okay, let's take a look at a map of Britain in, let's say, 8th century. Map of Britain in, let's say, 9th century. What did Britain look like in the 9th century AD? So now, if we look here, do we have something from Encyclopedia Britannica? Okay, so we have various kingdoms. Okay, as you can see on the map, there is Northumbria in the north. You have Mercia. You have East Anglia, Essex, Wessex, Sussex, Kent. Then you have Wales and Cumbria and so on. So the Angles, they set up the kingdom of East Anglia, possibly Kent. That's the Angles. And the Saxons, they set up Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Sussex, etc. So the Wessex is Western Saxons, Essex is the Eastern Saxons, Sussex is the Southern Saxons. Was Northumbria, was it Saxon, or was Northumbria Saxon or Anglo? Yeah, there we go. It probably was not Anglo. Okay, fine. So the point I'm making is the Angles and Saxons, they settled down in different parts of Britain. The Jutes were all the way down south. Essex, Sussex, Wessex were Saxon. Probably Northumbria, etc., and Mercia, etc., were settled by the Angles. But the deal is that the Angles and the Saxons did not fight each other. When these separate kingdoms were set up, it did not matter anymore whether these were Saxon kingdoms or Angle kingdoms. Even two Angle kingdoms would have differences, and they would fight each other at times. So it no longer mattered once they settled down and formed these kingdoms who was Angle and who was Saxon. Each kingdom was a rival of the other. and that was the deal. So there was no Angles versus Saxon kind of conflict, or Angles versus Saxons versus Jutes kind of conflict. It did not matter at all once the kingdoms were set up and you had different kings who ruled these different kingdoms. The kings would look at each other king as a potential rival. Sometimes there were wars, sometimes there were alliances, as is always the case. Then you have the Viking Age. So at the time, Wales remained a separate entity, more Celtic. Welsh and the Scottish, etc., were a separate entity, and so on. Then you have the Viking Age. The Vikings start plundering, invading, raiding, plundering the east coast of the British Islands of Britain. And because of that, all these kingdoms have to unite in a sense and fight the Vikings. So that gave rise to an Anglo-Saxon identity, which was separate from the Viking identity, and eventually gave rise to an English identity, as opposed to Viking identity or Welsh or Scottish or Irish identity. So eventually the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, they merged over time into a single Anglo-Saxon or English identity and ethnicity. And then you had the Norman invasion in the year 1066 AD. So it's been a long period of upheaval in England, and eventually it all coalesces into one single ethnic identity.